The Astor family name carries with it the weight of empires, fortunes, and towering mansions. Their story begins with John Jacob Astor, a man who arrived in America with little more than ambition and a vision for trade. By the early 19th century, he had built an empire rooted in fur trading, shipping, and eventually real estate in New York. His rise to wealth was nothing short of extraordinary, transforming him into the very symbol of American success. Yet behind the polished marble facades and glittering ballrooms there was always another story, a quieter one hidden beneath layers of respectability. The scandal that would later shake their name began like many family tragedies, with too much wealth and not enough unity. John Jacob Astor believed in empire building not just for himself but for his descendants. He envisioned a dynasty that would last centuries, a name etched into the very fabric of New York City. His investments in real estate laid the foundation for what would become some of the most valuable properties in Manhattan, including blocks along Broadway and Fifth Avenue. When he died in 1848, his fortune was estimated at more than $20 million, a staggering sum for the time, equivalent to billions today. Yet with that fortune came the burden of inheritance and expectations, burdens that would twist relationships within the family into something darker. The Astors were not content to be merely wealthy. They demanded influence, they commanded respect, they sought to be the arbiters of American society. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, often called the Mrs. Astor, became the reigning queen of New York high society. In the late 19th century, she dictated who was acceptable in the elite social circle. Her famous 400 list determined who mattered in a city where status was everything. But even as she cultivated a world of grandeur and prestige, the seeds of scandal had already been planted within her own family and would soon erupt. The scandal in question centered around power and legacy. It was not a crime of passion or a fleeting indiscretion, but something more enduring, a bitter feud over identity, legitimacy, and inheritance. It emerged when William Waldorf Astor and his cousin John Jacob Astor IV found themselves locked in a rivalry that would not only divide the family but also shape the very skyline of New York. The feud was born from jealousy, from the hunger for recognition, and from wounds that money could never heal. William Waldorf Astor was a man of immense ambition, yet he often felt overshadowed by his cousin John Jacob IV. While William inherited a vast fortune, he resented his position in the shadow of Caroline Astor, the social queen who recognized her own son John Jacob IV as the rightful leader of the family's social empire. This left William bitter and determined to outshine his relatives. His solution was as grand as it was symbolic. He built the Waldorf Hotel in New York City, a monument of luxury and modernity designed to eclipse anything his family rivals could produce. But the move sparked outrage and humiliation within the Astor clan. Caroline Astor and her son responded with equal force. John Jacob IV built the Astoria Hotel right next door, creating a rivalry that was as much architectural as it was personal. The two hotels eventually merged into the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most famous hotels in the world. Yet the family feud behind its creation revealed the deep cracks in the Astor dynasty. What the public saw as progress and glamour was in fact born of bitterness and rivalry, and it would only get worse. At the heart of the scandal was not simply a matter of hotels or mansions but of belonging and power. William Waldorf Astor eventually abandoned America altogether, moving to England where he would be granted the title of Viscount. He turned his back on the city his family had helped build, declaring himself done with the petty wars of New York society. But in doing so he left behind whispers and speculation. The Astors were fractured and their unity broken by pride, envy, and the insatiable hunger for status. What few people outside the family knew was that the rivalry carried a much darker undercurrent than society gossip. It was whispered that personal letters had been destroyed, reputations tarnished, even family ties severed beyond repair. The Astors had become symbols of wealth and class, but within their gilded halls bitterness festered and dignity eroded. Behind the chandeliers and banquets a scandal was quietly unfolding, one that threatened to erase the very legacy John Jacob Astor had fought to establish. By the dawn of the 20th century, tragedy struck once more. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, boarded the RMS Titanic in 1912. He perished in the disaster, leaving behind his 19-year-old pregnant wife Madeline and a complicated will. The newspapers of the time reveled in the drama, portraying the Astors not as paragons of American success but as a family marked by arrogance, misfortune, and endless feuds. What had begun as whispers of rivalry now became the headline of decline. The Astor scandal was not a single moment but a culmination of choices and rivalries, the story of a family that had everything yet risked it all for pride. It was a reminder that behind every great fortune there are often great secrets that threaten to undo everything built in stone and memory. And for the Astors it was the scandal of family that nearly destroyed their empire, even as the world marveled at the wealth they displayed. The Astor family name continued to dominate the skyline of New York, but the scandal that brewed beneath the surface refused to fade. The feud between William Waldorf Astor and John Jacob Astor IV had already left scars, but what followed was even more unsettling. As the 20th century dawned, the family faced not only rivalry but also the burden of reputation. Every move they made was scrutinized by newspapers and whispered about in drawing rooms of the wealthy, and yet beneath the glittering surface the Astors were living with a fractured identity, their fortune immense, their name renowned, but their unity torn apart. William Waldorf Astor settled permanently in England, leaving behind the city of his birth. He had grown tired of the endless battles with his cousin and with the iron rule of Caroline Astor, who refused to recognize him as the rightful leader of New York society. In England, William reinvented himself. He purchased grand estates and pursued political power, eventually being granted a peerage by the crown. His dream of status was realized not in America but across the Atlantic, yet this departure marked more than just a personal decision. It symbolized a turning point in the family's story. The Astors were no longer united by one vision, they were splintered into competing branches across continents. Back in New York, John Jacob Astor IV became the public face of the American Astors. He embodied wealth, elegance, and aristocratic bearing. He was a man who lived with grandeur, yet his personal life became a lightning rod for controversy. His marriage to Ava Lowell Willing ended in a scandalous divorce at a time when divorce was still rare among the elite. Newspapers seized on the story, portraying him not only as wealthy but also as reckless and self-indulgent. When he remarried a woman nearly 30 years younger than himself, Madeline forced, the scandal erupted into something far larger. Society pages buzzed with outrage, gossip, and fascination. The age difference between John Jacob IV and Madeline was shocking. For the time, he was in his late 40s and she only 19. Whispers spread quickly that the marriage was less about love and more about defiance. Critics accused him of tarnishing the family reputation. Others speculated that Madeline was motivated by wealth and ambition. The truth may have been more complex, but the perception of scandal was enough to damage the Astor name. Caroline Astor herself disapproved, bitterly refusing to accept Madeline as a proper addition to the family circle. The fracture widened. The dynasty's facade of unity crumbled further. Then came the Titanic disaster in 1912. John Jacob IV boarded the ill-fated ship with his young bride. The world watched in horror as the unsinkable vessel went down in icy waters. John Jacob IV, one of the richest men in America, perished, leaving Madeline widowed and pregnant at 19. The tragedy was front-page news across the globe, and while the public mourned, it also feasted on the drama of it. The fall of one of America's most prominent men seemed almost symbolic of a greater decline of the Gilded Age itself. The scandal did not end with his death. It deepened. His will left the majority of his vast estate to his son from his first marriage, Vincent Astor, while Madeline and the unborn child were given a smaller portion. This division fueled more gossip. Was John Jacob IV attempting to control the family narrative from beyond the grave? Was he punishing his young wife for the controversy she had brought to the family? The questions swirled endlessly, fueling the perception that the Astors were cursed by their own pride. Vincent Astor inherited immense wealth but also immense responsibility. At just 20 years old, he became one of the richest men in America and the head of a fractured family. His relationship with his stepmother Madeline remained strained. The newspapers followed every detail of their disputes, the estate, the trusts, the responsibilities. It all became part of the public spectacle. Instead of admiration, the Astors were increasingly viewed with suspicion and fascination. The grandeur that once inspired envy now seemed tainted by scandal, tragedy, and internal conflict. Meanwhile, William Waldorf Astor thrived in England, yet his choice to abandon America left his descendants with a different identity. While the English Astors pursued politics and titles, the American Astors grappled with scandal and public scrutiny. The two branches grew apart, separated not only by geography but also by purpose, one seeking aristocracy, the other struggling under the weight of American capitalism and media obsession. The legacy John Jacob Astor had envisioned for his family was no longer united. It was splintered into rival stories. The forgotten scandal of the Astors lies not only in personal rivalries or shocking marriages but in how their private conflicts became a public drama. They were no longer seen solely as builders of New York but as cautionary figures of what wealth could do to a family. Ambition, pride, jealousy, and the hunger for status tore them apart. Their story became a mirror of the dangers of unchecked wealth and ambition. By the time the Roaring Twenties arrived, the Astor name still carried weight, but it was no longer unblemished. The hotels, the mansions, the clubs they built all stood as monuments to their influence, yet every brick carried whispers of scandal. Behind the chandeliers and gilded walls there were broken families, bitter rivalries, and tragic losses. The Astors had built an empire, but they were trapped by it too. Their wealth could not protect them from scandal, nor shield them from the human flaws that would haunt their legacy. What began as a story of ambition and triumph had shifted into one of decline and division, and though the public still marveled at the Astor wealth, they also sensed the fragility beneath it. The dynasty was no longer untouchable. It was vulnerable to the same forces that tear apart ordinary families: jealousy, betrayal, and loss. As the decades passed, the Astor family continued to live under the shadow of their fortune, but also under the weight of their scandals. Vincent Astor, the heir who had inherited much of his father's wealth after the Titanic tragedy, was a figure of both fascination and contradiction. He carried the name and the fortune, but the pressure of legacy shaped him into a man who struggled between duty and desire. He worked to restore the family's reputation and at times succeeded, but behind the polished image was a life filled with loneliness, strained relationships, and unfulfilled ambitions. Vincent was only 20 when his father perished on the Titanic. The responsibility placed upon him was immense. He inherited not only millions but also estates, businesses, and the expectations of an entire nation. People looked to him as the next great Astor, the one who would restore dignity and guide the dynasty into the new century. Yet Vincent was not his father. He did not share the same charisma nor the same appetite for publicity. Instead, he became a reserved figure, someone who guarded his privacy but whose life remained a topic of endless speculation. His first marriage to Helen Huntington was a match that seemed perfect on paper. She came from a wealthy background. She was elegant, refined, and part of the same elite circles. Together they were supposed to embody stability and strength for the Astor name, but the marriage proved to be cold and distant. Helen was strong-willed and sharp-tongued. Vincent was reserved and withdrawn. The tension between them was whispered about in society circles. Soon, their union became yet another example of how wealth could not guarantee happiness, and their eventual divorce further fed the image of instability in the Astor legacy. Vincent's second marriage to Mary Benedict Baker brought temporary warmth, but it too was plagued with struggles. Vincent had a restless nature. He suffered from poor health and emotional strain, and his search for fulfillment often led him to retreat into isolation. The public may have seen a man of immense privilege, but those closest to him saw a figure weighed down by the ghosts of his family's history. He was haunted by the knowledge that no matter what he achieved, his name carried with it both admiration and suspicion. Despite his personal struggles, Vincent worked to reinvent the Astor legacy through philanthropy. He donated generously to institutions, universities, and charities. His name became attached to hospitals, libraries, and foundations. He wanted to shift the family image away from scandal and extravagance towards service and responsibility. For a time, this work society began to see him not as a man trapped by scandal, but as someone who used his inheritance for the greater good. Yet even in philanthropy, there were critics. Some argued that Vincent was not motivated by compassion but by the need to erase the blemishes of his family name. Meanwhile, other members of the Astor family pursued their own paths and added to the growing narrative of scandal. Vincent's half-brother John Jacob Astor, born after the Titanic tragedy, often clashed with Vincent over inheritance issues. He believed he deserved more of the family fortune, and their disputes became the subject of lawsuits and bitter headlines. Instead of unity, the Astors were once again divided by wealth and ambition. These very public feuds revealed the fractures within the dynasty, reminding the world that beneath the grandeur of their name they were a family at war with itself. As the 20th century advanced, the role of the Astors in New York society began to shift. Once they had been the gatekeepers of the city's elite, now their influence waned as new families rose to power. The Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and later new money industrialists and financiers began to dominate the landscape. The Astors still held immense wealth, but their scandals had weakened their claim to moral authority in high society. They were no longer the unquestioned leaders. They were symbols of a bygone era haunted by past mistakes. Vincent's death in 1959 marked another turning point. He left no children to inherit his fortune. Instead, much of his estate went to his third wife, Brooke Astor, a woman who would later become one of the most prominent figures in New York philanthropy. Brooke's name eventually became synonymous with charity, grace, and influence. She helped restore some of the Astor prestige by becoming the city's leading benefactor, funding museums, libraries, and social causes. But even Brooke's story ended in controversy. In her later years, allegations of neglect and financial abuse by her own son sparked another scandal, proving that no matter how much good the Astors tried to do, their name could never fully escape the shadow of betrayal and greed. What makes the Astor scandal so memorable is not one single event but the pattern that repeated itself across generations. Ambition, rivalry, betrayal, tragedy, and scandal seemed to follow them at every turn. Their immense fortune was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed them to build New York, shape culture, and dominate society, but it also exposed their flaws to the world, magnified their mistakes, and ensured that their private battles became public spectacles. By the mid-20th century the Astors were no longer the uncontested rulers of society, yet their story remained captivating not just for what they built but for what they lost. Their wealth had endured, their name was still carved into hotels and landmarks, but their unity was gone, their reputation fractured, their empire reduced to stories of past grandeur and whispered scandals. The forgotten scandal of the Astors reminds us that even the mightiest families can fall prey to the same struggles that ordinary people face: love, betrayal, jealousy, and ambition, only magnified by unimaginable wealth. Instead of escaping scandal, their fortune ensured that every mistake was broadcast to the world and every failure became part of their permanent legacy. The Astors built New York, but they also built a cage around themselves, and within that cage they fought, suffered, and endured. Their scandal is not just about one marriage or one feud, it is about how wealth magnifies flaws, how power isolates, and how the pursuit of legacy can consume the very people who seek to preserve it. The story of the Astor family is more than a tale of riches and power. It is a meditation on human ambition, greed, and the fragility of legacy. The Astors began with John Jacob Astor, who arrived in America with little more than determination and vision. His fur trading empire gave birth to the first great American fortune. His real estate investments cemented the family's dominance in New York. For over a century they lived in mansions that symbolized not only wealth but power. They dictated who could enter the upper echelons of society, and their name became synonymous with influence and prestige. Yet behind that glittering facade, cracks were always forming, cracks that widened over generations until the dynasty itself began to collapse. The forgotten scandal of the Astors lies not in a single dramatic event but in the slow erosion of their unity and the endless betrayals that consumed them generation after generation. The family could never quite escape its own shadow. Feuds over inheritance, battles for social dominance, and rivalries between cousins, uncles, and siblings ensured that peace never lasted long. Each generation seemed determined to outdo the previous one, not in achievements but in conflicts, and the press recorded it all with a mixture of fascination and condemnation. In many ways the Astors represent the archetype of the American dream fulfilled and destroyed. They reached the pinnacle of wealth but discovered that money alone could not secure happiness or stability. John Jacob Astor may have built a fortune that defined his era, but his descendants could not maintain it because the foundation was wealth without unity, privilege without purpose, power without empathy. The scandals that followed them were not accidents, they were the natural result of a family consumed by its own image and burdened by its own history. By the late 20th century the Astor name was still recognized, but it carried far less weight than before. They were no longer shaping the destiny of New York. Instead they had become characters in the city's history, remembered in museums and books and whispered stories of grandeur and decline. Their mansions had become relics, their wealth had scattered through countless divisions of inheritance, their scandals had become lessons for historians and storytellers who understood that no dynasty, no matter how wealthy, can survive without trust and cohesion. The legacy of Brooke Astor provides perhaps the clearest example of the paradox of the Astors. She dedicated her life to philanthropy and ensured that the family's name remained connected to cultural and humanitarian causes. She symbolized grace, dignity, and responsibility, yet even her final years were marked by betrayal as her son was accused of mistreating her and manipulating her estate. The scandal was tragic, not only because it revealed greed but because it exposed the vulnerability of an elderly woman who had once stood as the face of generosity. Brooke Astor's life and death closed the book on a dynasty that could never truly escape scandal. Today when we walk the streets of New York we still see the name Astor engraved into stone. Astor Place, Astoria, the Waldorf Astoria. These are monuments to a family that once ruled the city, yet they are also tombstones of ambition. They remind us of the impermanence of power and the inevitability of decline. The Astors may have built an empire, but their inability to preserve unity ensured that their fortune and their influence would vanish, leaving behind only stories. The forgotten scandal of the Astors continues to resonate because it touches on universal truths. Families across the world have faced betrayals, arguments over inheritance, rivalries between siblings. The difference is that when these conflicts happen within ordinary families they fade with time, but when they happen within dynasties like the Astors they become history. They are recorded, analyzed, and remembered as cautionary tales. The Astors remind us that even the wealthiest families are human, subject to the same flaws, the same desires, the same weaknesses. In the end, the story of the Astors is not about money at all. It is about people, people who dreamed of empire, people who fought over power, people who betrayed one another, and people who tried desperately to preserve a name that was always slipping away. Their legacy teaches us that money can build mansions, but it cannot build loyalty. It can purchase influence, but it cannot purchase love. It can create dynasties, but it cannot protect them from collapse. When we look at the Astor story today, we are left with questions as haunting as they are fascinating. What does it mean to preserve a legacy? What is the true value of wealth if it divides rather than unites? What is remembered in the end, the fortune or the scandal, the empire or the betrayal? Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Astors is not their empire but their cautionary tale, a reminder that the greatest fortunes can vanish, not through external enemies but through the battles fought within the family itself. The Astor family's forgotten scandal is not forgotten at all. It lives on in history books and documentaries and conversations about power and legacy. It lives on because it speaks to something timeless, the struggle between ambition and morality, between wealth and unity, between legacy and humanity. The Astors built New York, but they could not build peace within their own walls, and in that contradiction their story remains one of the most powerful and haunting in American history.